The jagged steel of a tank tread is ground into the waterlogged earth. Heavy steel links lie scattered across mangled ruts, torn apart by the force of a blast. Thick, slate-gray smoke seeps through the shattered louvers of the engine compartment. Inside, the sweltering, cramped fighting compartment, the tank's radio wheezes. July 1944, Western Ukraine. The airwaves struggle through a wall of static. A voice from HQ punches through in short, clipped phrases. The order is clear. Scuttle the vehicle. The crew is to fall back to the rear immediately. The noose is tightening. Recon reported in half an hour ago. A German motorized column has broken through the defensive line in the adjacent sector. The enemy is swinging into the completely exposed flank of a Soviet rifle division. The division is collapsing into a pocket. Standing in the path of the German tanks and infantry-laden half-tracks is a single machine, an SU-152 self-propelled heavy howitzer, 43 tons of Soviet steel. The chassis is wrecked, the result of a direct hit from a heavy artillery shell. The idler wheel has been sheared off. The road wheels have sagged into the viscous mud. The machine is completely immobilized. The lieutenant slowly pulls off his damp headset. Not long ago, his fingers had held nothing but schoolroom chalk. He used to draw perfect geometric shapes on a cold slate chalkboard. Now, his hands are stained deep with thick gun grease, powder soot, and dried blood. His intellect functions without panic. His brain methodically calculates the closing speed of the enemy armor. He assesses the complex terrain. He counts the remaining seconds. The arithmetic of death is stark and merciless. If the crew follows the direct order from HQ and sets the TNT charges under the ammo rack, they will live. The infantry in the rear will inevitably die. The motorized column will break into the operational rear and crush the retreating rifle regiments under steel tracks. The math teacher stares at the crosshairs of the panoramic sight. The enemy is moving through a wide basin. The axis of advance intersects the line of fire of the stationary heavy gun. It creates an ideal plane for a blocking action. A burst from a heavy machine gun hammers against the frontal armor. The metal rings deafeningly. The lead German motorcycle scouts have already reached visual range. Armor-piercing rounds whistle as they kick up showers of sparks from the 3 inches of armored steel. The crew sits frozen in their seats. Their breathing is ragged. Inside the cramped casemate, the temperature hits 50 degrees Celsius. Acrid diesel fumes pool under the armor. The air grows thick, physically heavy to inhale. The smell of scorched insulation mingles with the sour sweat of the men. The lieutenant shifts his heavy gaze to the driver mechanic. The man holds his hands hopelessly on the dead control levers. Oil pressure is plummeting. The damaged engine gasps and dies. A ringing silence follows, broken only by the dull thuds of lead hitting the exterior. HQ ordered us to scuttle. The commander's voice sounds flat, devoid of emotion. We can't get the right track back together, the driver states, staring at the smashed instrument panel. The links are pulverized. Distance to the vanguard, 3 kilometers. The column is at march speed. They'll be here in exactly 40 minutes. The gunner swallows a dry lump in his throat, his eyes never leaving the traverse hand wheels. The loader braces his shoulder heavily against the massive breech of the howitzer gun. His muscles are strained to the limit. The narrow space claws at the psyche. "Are we bugging out?" the loader asks, wiping sweat from his forehead with a grimy hand. "We're staying," the lieutenant says, turning away from the silenced radio. "Prepare the vehicle for combat." The order has been defied. The point of no return has been crossed forever. The fear of a court-martial for disobeying a direct command instantly recedes before the encroaching slaughter. The math teacher discards thoughts of his own survival. In his head, a complex system of equations takes shape. The variables are the thickness of German armor, the muzzle velocity of a concrete-piercing shell, and a narrow field of fire. The gun has a critically limited horizontal traverse, only 12 degrees. If the enemy column moves outside these rigid limits, the heavy machine becomes a useless, blind target. It will become a mass grave for 5 men. The crew accepts this risk in silence. No wasted words, no promises to stand to the death, only cold calculation and a readiness to do the heavy work. The gunner checks the elevation mechanism. The gears grind as they turn. The barrel slowly shifts its angle. The lieutenant presses his eye to the sight again. The field of vision is restricted to the dirt road emerging from the forest. It is there, in the optical crosshairs, that the equation of life and death for an entire division must be solved. The German motorcycles turn and head back toward the main force. The enemy recon has felt out the knocked-out Soviet self-propelled gun. The enemy is certain the machine has been abandoned. 39 minutes remain until the lead elements appear. The countdown has begun. Every second echoes as a dull throb of blood in their temples. The metal of the roof hatches clangs back. Hot air rushes out from the gut of the war machine. The crew drops heavily onto the sodden earth. The grueling, filthy work begins. 43 tons of dead steel must be hidden in the folds of the terrain. The crippled SPG must be transformed into a fixed, invulnerable pillbox. There is practically no time. Shovels bite into the dense, wet soil with a dry crunch. The commander assesses the hillside with a cold stare. He calculates the angle of the slope. He gauges the density of the clay-heavy soil. He measures the firing sector. In his mind, the geometric blueprint of a death trap is clearly drawn. The former math teacher cuts off all emotion. He leaves only the dry, ruthless geometry of combat. The optical sight provides a critically narrow window of observation, exactly 12 degrees horizontally. This is the rigid width of the kill zone. If the German column moves beyond this limit, the crew is finished. The heavy howitzer won't be able to traverse its massive barrel far enough. The machine will turn into a useless, blind target. The shovels strike without pause. Wet clay flies from the blades. Muscles cramp from the savage physical exertion. The driver mechanic grabs a heavy steel sledgehammer. The blows against a bent idler arm ring in their ears. He is trying to level the machine's skewed base. The road reels must sit flush on a solid foundation. Otherwise, the colossal recoil of the 152mm gun will throw off the aim after the very first shot, and the machine will simply slide into the ravine. The commander measures the distance with steady paces. His eye for distance works like a precision optical rangefinder. He methodically marks landmarks on the terrain. A lone oak by the roadside, 1,200 meters. A sharp bend in the dirt road before the basin, 800 meters. The scorched frame of a peasant cart, 400 meters. Each mark is a specific adjustment in the panoramic sight. These are measured in mils. The wind is blowing from the east at 5 meters per second. The commander's brain factors in the ballistic correction for spin drift and the lateral drift of the super-heavy shell. Peaceful formulas from a high school physics textbook take on a monstrous, practical meaning. They calculate the trajectory of a piece of steel capable of ripping armored hardware into atoms. "The ground is sagging under the left side," the driver rasps. He wipes his grimy face with the sleeve of a sweat-soaked tunic.
"The elevation angle is going to drop."
"Pack oak logs under the sheared idler," the commander snaps, his eyes never leaving the road. "Lock the base down tight. Dig deeper." The work continues. The loader climbs down into the stifling, sun-baked casemate. His task is to ensure an uninterrupted conveyor of death. Large caliber does not forgive human weakness. A single high-explosive shell weighs 43 kilograms. A concrete piercing shell weighs exactly 40 kilograms. Separate loading ammunition doubles the prep time for a shot. First, the heavy shell goes into the barrel. Then the brass casing with the powder propellant charge is rammed in behind it. The loader hauls the massive metal cylinders from the lower tiers of the ammo rack. His fingers slip treacherously on the thick gun grease. The skin on his palms gives way under the rough friction and splits. Blood mixes with the dark grease, leaving sticky smears on the cold steel of the casings. He moves the shells closer to the breech of the heavy gun. He is building up a critical stockpile to ensure the maximum rate of fire in the first, most terrifying minutes of the coming fight. The standard ammo racks are too far and awkward. In close combat, every lost fraction of a second costs the entire crew their lives. His back creaks under the unbearable load. His breathing turns into a ragged, painful whistle. 40 kilograms. Lift from the iron floor. Pivot in the cramped space. Rack it. 40 kilograms. Lift. Pivot. Rack. A mechanical, monotonous repetition. Muscles burn with a primal fire. The loader completely blocks out the pain. The pain will come later, if they survive this meat grinder. Right now, there is only the unbearable weight of metal and the dull clank of ammunition being laid out for action. "What's the point-blank range?" the gunner asks hollowly from behind the armor mask. 800 meters, the commander answers sharply, jumping onto the scorching armor. "We let the enemy get close. We make it count. 1 shell per target." The machine slowly settles into the earth. The ground swallows the mangled steel. The slope of the hill merges completely with the low silhouette of the armored casemate. The crew throws on a camouflage net. They cover the frontal armor plates with dry branches, dust, and clumps of turf. A perfect, invisible ambush is formed. A mathematically calculated point of total annihilation. The engineering solution to an absolutely impossible tactical problem is complete. The commander is the last to drop through the hatch. The heavy steel lid slams shut with a roar, cutting off the daylight. An ominous gloom instantly takes hold inside. The space smells of heated metal, old gunpowder, and acrid male sweat. The temperature inside the casemate climbs past 40 degrees. The air is thick enough to cut with a knife. The fans are silent. The crew is conserving the last of the battery charge. The crew takes their combat stations. Claustrophobia immediately begins to press against their temples. 4 men are locked tight in a narrow steel box. There is no way back. Tension thickens in the air. It becomes physically palpable. A dead silence presses against their eardrums. All that can be heard is the heavy, ragged breathing of comrades and the quiet, cooling clink of heated metal. The gunner presses his face to the rubber eyepiece of the sight. The mill scale glows dimly in the gloom of the fighting compartment. The commander's fingers rest on the radio toggle, but he doesn't switch it on. The airwaves are dead. They are completely alone. "Concrete piercing. Load," the lieutenant commands, dry and sharp. The clatter of the sliding wedge breech opening ruthlessly shatters the ringing silence. The 40-kilogram steel shell enters the open breech with a dull, heavy thud. A heavy brass casing of powder follows it with a metallic clank. The breech block slams shut with a sharp, metallic strike. It locks death-tight inside the thick-walled barrel.
Gun ready.
The loader exhales hoarsely. He mechanically wipes his bloodied hands on his canvas trousers. "Site 0. Await visual contact." Suddenly, the earth shudders almost imperceptibly. This isn't the lone blast of a stray artillery shell.
It is a low-frequency, heavy vibration transmitted monotonically through the dense soil. The thick, steady drone of dozens of powerful engines is borne far beyond the edge of the coniferous forest. It builds rapidly. It fills the entire surrounding space. The vibration transfers from the ground to the metal of the armored casemate. The crosshairs of the optical sight tremble slightly. A thin stream of dry dust trickles from the internal armor plates directly onto the sweaty faces of the tankers. The enemy is reaching the attack line. Schoolroom math is over. The ruthless physics of destruction begins. Thick clouds of gray dust rise above the edge of the pine forest. The panoramic optics ruthlessly lock onto the target. The vanguard of the enemy motorized column rolls out onto the dirt road. Diesel exhaust fumes mingle with the morning mist. A medium tank leads the way, providing heavy cover. Behind it stretches a long line of open-topped half-tracks. The enemy is absolutely calm. German infantry sits relaxed on the armor. The soldiers are smoking. They are laughing, shouting over the roar of the engines. The victors are driving to finish off the broken Soviet rifle regiments. Their forward recon has already reported a completely clear sector. The mangled wreck of a stationary machine on the hill raised no suspicion from the scouts. The column moves in a tight march formation, exposing their flanks. The distance closes. 1,200 meters. The gunner's hand convulsively grips the steel firing handwheel. His finger rests on the trigger. "Range 1,200. Target in the crosshairs," the gunner rasps hollowly. "Hold your fire," the lieutenant snaps. "Wait."
Let them get close. The silence inside the sweltering casemate becomes unbearable. All that can be heard is the ragged breathing of 4 men and the rising metallic clatter of enemy tracks. Sweat pours into their eyes. The salt stings their eyelids. They cannot blink. The distance is melting away. 1,000 meters. 800 meters. The target enters the zone of guaranteed destruction. Nerves are frayed to the breaking point. Every moment of waiting sears the psyche. Through the narrow vision slits, the faces of the enemy soldiers are now clearly visible. The caked mud on the road wheels of the lead tank is visible. The enemy is walking deep into the death trap. The barrel of the heavy howitzer gun is aimed exactly at the center of the column. 600 meters. The tank exposes its vulnerable side armor at a perfect angle. "Concrete piercing! Fire!" the commander barks. The gunner mashes the trigger. The firing pin strikes the primer of the massive casing. Inside the enclosed space of the breach, kilograms of artillery powder instantly ignite. A monstrous roar shatters their eardrums. The 43-ton machine shudders violently through its entire hull. The massive recoil throws the heavy barrel back. The hydraulic recoil buffers scream as they dissipate the colossal kinetic energy. The 152mm concrete piercing shell, weighing 40 kilograms, leaves the muzzle at 600 meters per second. It is pure, primal power, directed straight into the enemy's steel. Time compresses. The shell stitches through the air and slams into the side of the lead tank. The armored steel cannot withstand a kinetic strike of such devastating force. It shatters. The shell punches through the metal, enters the fighting compartment, and detonates. The tank instantly ceases to exist. The internal explosion of the ammunition rack rips the multi-ton turret off its ring. A mangled piece of flaming metal flies high into the air. A pillar of roaring flame erupts from the ruptured hull. The shockwave hammers into the vehicles following behind. The kill zone snaps shut. The vanguard is blinded and completely disoriented. The drivers of the open half-tracks instinctively yank their control levers. The vehicles veer off the narrow dirt road at full speed. Tracks bog down in deep ditches. Half-tracks collide head-on with a roar. The clatter of crumpling metal drowns out the screams of the wounded infantry. Enemy soldiers tumble chaotically from the troop compartments directly under the wheels of the following trucks. In seconds, the tight march formation turns into a bleeding, burning wreck. Inside the cramped casemate of the SPG, there is no time for observation. The air instantly thickens with acrid propellant gases. The exhaust fan is dead. Breathing becomes physically painful. Toxic gases sear the lungs. "High explosive! Load!" the commander screams through the incessant ringing in his ears. The loader yanks open the massive sliding wedge breech. With a loud hiss, the scorching brass casing flies out. It hits the iron floor with a clang, burning his boots. The loader grabs a new shell. Blood from his shredded palms stays on the cold metal. He rams death into the breech with all his strength. The powder charge follows. The wedge clacks, locking the barrel tight. The enemy recovers quickly. This is an elite motorized unit. Enemy commanders spot the slate-blue smoke of the shot on the hillside. Officers scream themselves hoarse, barking orders. The surviving armored vehicles traverse their machine guns toward the ambush. The first tracers stitch the air. Bullets hammer against the camouflage net. They shear off branches and kick up bright sparks from the frontal armor of the SPG. A heavy volume of return fire begins. The lieutenant presses his face to the cold metal of the periscope. He selects the next target. In the center of the chaos, a half-track packed with infantry is stuck.
Range 500. Landmark, the burnt cart. HE, fire.
A second earthquake rocks the casemate. The gun's recoil clangs as it returns the barrel to its place. The HE shell slams exactly into the center of the cluster of hardware. The explosion of dozens of kilograms of explosives and steel pulverizes the half-track. The crater swallows the mangled metal. Shrapnel mows down the prone infantry within a 50-meter radius. The earth mixes with burning diesel. Two surviving medium tanks from the rear of the column crawl out from behind the burning wrecks. They traverse their turrets in sync. The long-barreled guns feel out the stationary target on the hill. The distance closes to 400 meters. A heavy, armor-piercing slug ricochets off the SPG's frontal plate with a wild shriek. Inside the casemate, steel rivets fly off. Sharp metal spalling slashes the driver mechanic's face. A blinding flash. The ambush is compromised. The trap has turned into an arena for survival. A second armor-piercing slug rips through the camouflage net with a deafening shriek. 75 millimeters of sloped steel armor take the colossal kinetic hit. The 43 tons of the Soviet machine shudder violently. Inside the fighting compartment, there is a dry, deafening crack. The metal holds. The slope of the armor plate sends the enemy shell into a ricochet. The slug screams off into the gray sky. But the massive kinetic energy of the impact shears off heavy steel rivets from the inside of the armored casemate. Red-hot chunks of metal whistle through the cramped, enclosed space. A sharp, jagged fragment rips open the gunner's shoulder. Blood instantly soaks the thick fabric of his faded tunic. The gunner ignores the pain. His eye is pressed tight against the rubber eyepiece of the optical sight. His hands grip the icy handwheels of the laying mechanisms. There is nothing left to breathe. The exhaust fan is completely without power.
The concentration of toxic propellant gases has reached a critical limit. Thick, slate-gray smoke eats at their eyes. It burns the throat with every breath. The loader works on pure instinct. The survival instinct has been completely bypassed. Only muscle memory remains. A 40-kilogram shell. A violent yank from the rack. A step to the scorching breach.
The heavy metal hits the guides. The heavy brass casing with the powder charge follows. The clack of the wedge breech cuts through the seconds. The stripped skin on his palms leaves bloody streaks on the yellow brass. His fingers are locked in a brutal cramp. The loader falls heavily to his knees before the open lower ammo rack. He grabs the next shell. There is a catastrophic lack of air. Lungs burn with a primal fire. The conveyor of destruction must not stop for a single second. Right 005, tank in cover, HE! The lieutenant rasps mechanically. Target in sight, the gunner answers curtly. The enemy is recovering fast. Rigid German discipline breaks the initial panic. Surviving officers establish a solid firing line. Enemy infantry rolls into the deep ditches and deploys heavy machine guns on bipods. Half-tracks reverse, clearing the line of fire for the medium tanks. The enemy guns methodically feel out the stationary position on the hillside. The crossfire intensifies with every second. Tracers hit the SPG's frontal armor in a solid, shimmering stream. The ring of lead merges into a single, monotonous drone. The armor is covered in hundreds of small dents. Fire! The lieutenant snaps. The trigger is mashed down, the strike of the steel pin, the detonation of the propellant charge. A deafening roar shakes the cramped casemate. The recoil of the massive barrel throws the spent casing back. A thick cloud of scorching gas hits the tankers' faces. The 152mm high-explosive shell streaks toward the target. Range, 400 meters. The shell slams into the frontal armor of the enemy tank.
The detonation of dozens of kilograms of explosive filler crushes the thick armor plates into the enemy's fighting compartment. The weld seams burst. The German machine's turret grinds down into the ruptured hull. A massive blast wave sweeps away the infantry lying around the tank. Charred bodies are thrown dozens of meters into the tall grass. The counterattack is instantaneous. Another enemy armor-piercing shell slams into the seam of the SPG's heavy plating. A deafening roar paralyzes the senses. The lieutenant collapses onto the steel floor of the fighting compartment. A thin, hot trickle of blood leaks from his ears. His eardrums have ruptured from the sudden concussive spike. The world goes silent. All that remains is the dull, continuous vibration of metal and the heavy pulsing of blood in his temples. The commander braces himself against a mangled ammunition rack and heaves himself to his feet with a powerful jerk. He looks at the gunner. The man is still cranking the hand wheel. The machine is alive. The gun is functional. Range 300, armor piercing, lead vehicle. The commander reads the words from the gunner's lips and nods. The loader slams another 40-kilogram shell into the breech. Metal clangs against metal. The round is seated. The breech blocks. Fire. Recoil. The ejection of a glowing, red-hot casing. The enemy tank jerks from the direct hit of the anti-concrete shell. The armor is punched clean through. Kinetic energy shreds the internal mechanisms. The enemy engine erupts in brilliant flames. A pillar of thick, black smoke rises over the dirt road. Another heavy blow strikes the Soviet SPG's frontal armor. Spalling from the inner plating shears off the vision blocks. Deep cracks spiderweb across the thick glass of the commander's observation device. Visibility drops to critical levels. The lieutenant wipes grit and blood from his face. He presses his eye to the narrow vision slit. Enemy infantry are attempting to flank the position from the right. Soldiers in grey uniforms move in short rushes through the thick brush. They are carrying magnetic mines and satchel charges. Distance, 200 meters. Too close for a heavy howitzer. Infantry on the right flank! Frag! Fire! The commander screams, his voice cracking.
The gun barks flame. The HE shell detonates in the treetops above the attackers. A lethal rain of steel splinters and jagged wood blankets the entire grid square. The shockwave snaps thick pine trunks with a dry crunch. The assault founders in blood. The SPG's thick frontal armor is growing white-hot. It is impossible to touch the interior walls of the casemate. Skin burns instantly on contact. The driver sits motionless. His primary task is to hold the machine on the brakes after every shot, preventing 43 tons of metal from sliding down the slope under the monstrous recoil of the heavy gun. His hands are locked onto the stiff steering levers. His face has become a grey, motionless mask of embedded cordite grime, motor oil, and sweat. His eyes are inflamed, tracking the dropping pressure. Empty casings rattle across the metal floor, searing his legs. There is no more room to maneuver. The crew stands ankle-deep in spent brass. Every movement causes unbearable physical pain. The gun barrel is smoking. The paint on the breech is beginning to bubble from the extreme temperatures. A new armor-piercing shell rocks the SPG. The slug hits the right side of the massive gun mantlet. A fountain of sparks floods the cramped fighting compartment. Startled, the loader drops a heavy brass casing. It slams into his boot with a crash, shattering the bones in his foot. He collapses onto the iron floor, gasping from pain and the thick, toxic smoke. The lieutenant steps over him without a word. The commander himself hauls the heavy propellant charge off the floor. He rams the slick casing into the hot breech with brute force.
The clang of the sliding wedge breech follows, a hard strike on the firing lever. Fire. Another enemy APC disintegrates into burning fragments. The rhythm of the battle turns into an endless, merciless mechanical cycle. Load, aim, destroy. Take a hit, survive. Load again, aim again. The conveyor belt of death is operating at the limit of human and technical capacity. The mangled steel continues to hold the line. A shell strikes the seam of the frontal armor. A deafening roar tears through the enclosed space of the casemate. A bright flash blinds the crew for a fraction of a second. The shockwave crumples the steel. The thick metal cannot withstand the monstrous kinetic pressure. A massive fragment of the enemy AP slug rips through the outer sheet of steel with a wild shriek. A red-hot chunk of jagged iron bites deep into the heavy gun mantlet. The 43 tons of the Soviet SPG shudder from the direct hit. Inside the fighting compartment, the dim interior lights instantly fail. The air fills with thick, acrid dust, stinging powder smoke, and the nauseating stench of burning electrical wiring. The gunner instinctively cranks the elevation handwheel, trying to bring the gun back onto the sightline. The steel gears emit a foul, strained screech. The rotation stops abruptly. The handwheel jams dead, nearly breaking his fingers. The teeth of the elevation rack have been sheared off by the raw physical force of the explosion. The heavy barrel of the 152mm gun howitzer freezes at its maximum elevation angle. The gun is paralyzed. The massive muzzle brake stares helplessly at the gray, smoke-choked sky. The lieutenant presses himself to the shattered vision block. The German mechanized infantry immediately assess the change in the situation. The enemy's seasoned frontline soldiers see the unnaturally upturned barrel of the heavy machine. The enemy immediately halts the frontal assault. Gray silhouettes dash forward in rapid rushes. They roll into a deep hollow directly in front of the hill, moving out of the line of fire. The enemy confidently enters the dead zone. The distance is rapidly closing to 100 meters, 50 meters. The depression angle of the jammed gun no longer allows them to reach the attackers with either AP or HE rounds.
In 3 minutes, the German infantry will swarm the blind armor. Heavy anti-tank grenades and smoke canisters will be tossed into the open hatches. The crew will suffocate or burn alive in the cramped steel box, turned into a mass grave. "The mechanism is jammed solid," the gunner rasps, tearing his fingernails against the immobile iron handwheel. "The mantlet is wrecked. The barrel won't come down." The lieutenant makes the only possible decision. It is an absolutely suicidal risk. "Strip the breech guards. Get the heavy tools from the kit," the commander barks through a violent coughing fit. The loader forgets about the shattered bones in his foot. He drops heavily onto the hot iron floor, kicking aside red-hot spent casings. The hull plating sears his bloodied palms. His fingers frantically tear away the canvas covers and metal shields. The crew completely exposes the internal mechanisms of the massive gun. The lieutenant snatches a 5-foot steel crowbar from the chest. The loader grabs a heavy 16-pound sledgehammer. A primal, desperate struggle begins between mangled men and twisted metal. The cramped casemate turns into a white-hot forge of hell. The temperature climbs past 120 degrees. Acrid sweat floods their inflamed eyes, washing away thick soot and clotted blood. The air is thick. They have to swallow it with pain. The lieutenant drives the end of the thick steel crowbar into the narrow gap between the massive breech and the damaged gun cradle. The metal groans piteously under the strain. "Hit it!" the commander growls, throwing his entire weight onto the cold steel of the lever. The loader takes a short, jagged swing in the impossibly cramped space of the fighting compartment. The heavy sledgehammer whistles through the air, thick with propellant gases. A dull, terrifying blow crashes against the steel base of the breech. Showers of blinding sparks fly in all directions, searing faces and hands. The massive mount doesn't even flinch. The red-hot fragment wedged outside holds the barrel fast, as if in a vice. The enemy is already at the foot of the hill. Through the thick armor, the crunch of dry branches under hobnailed boots is clearly audible. Sharp, clipped commands in a foreign tongue ring out. The enemy infantry is preparing for the final rush on the wounded machine. The soldiers are pulling out magnetic-shaped charge mines. They are clicking the safeties on their grenades. Death is standing right outside the armor plate. "Again!" the lieutenant exhales. His hands slip treacherously on the smooth metal of the crowbar from the heavy sweat and fresh blood. A second blow from the heavy sledgehammer shatters the ringing silence of the casemate. The recoil jars the loader's joints. His back muscles seize in a violent cramp. The tool bounces off the thick armor steel with a clang. No result. The driver abandons the dead steering levers. He squeezes into the narrow gap between the commander and the loader. 3 exhausted men throw themselves against a single stubborn piece of dead iron. All they have left is raw physical strength and an absolute hatred for the approaching end. The third blow. The sledgehammer strikes with the maximum arc a human body is capable of in that narrow iron box. A monstrous ringing slams against their ruptured eardrums. The crowbar bends into a springy arc under the immense weight of the 3 tankers. The metal outside lets out a long, strained moan. The mangled teeth of the elevation mechanism fly out of their sockets with a loud crack. The German shell fragment releases the jammed mantlet with a foul screech.
Tons of gun steel instantly lose their support. The massive steel breech shears off its stop. The heavy barrel of the gun howitzer collapses downward under its own weight with a monstrous roar. A sharp metallic clang shakes the entire SPG to its foundations. The gun falls perfectly parallel to the ground.
The barrel stops exactly in a horizontal position. The dead zone is eliminated forever. The enormous maw of the 152mm bore stares directly into the faces of the attacking German infantry. The distance has closed to 30 meters. The optical sight is no longer needed. The enemy is at arm's length. The point of no return has been crossed. The heavy barrel of the 152mm gun howitzer sits motionless, parallel to the cratered earth. The monstrous metallic screeching fades. A ringing, dead silence follows. The distance to the advancing German infantry has closed to 30 meters. The enemy has frozen. The soldiers in gray uniforms stare in horror into the black maw of the enormous gun. They are looking death in the eye at point-blank range. Optical instruments are no longer necessary. Aiming is done through the open bore. The lieutenant sees faces twisted with fear through the narrow slit of the shattered vision block. "He-frag!" The commander's voice sounds steady and dry. There is no hatred in it, nor fear. Only the mechanical statement of fact. "Too close," the loader rasps hoarsely. He spits thick blood onto the red-hot iron floor. "Our own ammo racks will cook off from the blast. It'll rip us apart right along with them." "Load it." It is the pure mathematics of suicide. Firing a 43-kilogram HE charge at a range of less than 50 meters defies every law of ballistics. It is a direct violation of every survival manual. A shockwave of such destructive power will inevitably slam into the Soviet machine's frontal armor. A point-blank HE detonation is capable of buckling welded seams. It could detonate the propellant charges remaining on the racks. The crew knows the physics of the process. The crew accepts this colossal risk. The alternative is guaranteed death from the magnetic-shaped charge mines the enemy is already clutching in their hands. The loader takes a short breath. The air sears his torn lungs. His mangled foot pulses with savage pain. He grabs a heavy HE frag shell from the lower tier. 43 kilograms of death settle onto the steel guides with a thud. A hard strike with his palm. The shell slides into the hot breech. The brass casing with the full propellant charge clangs in behind it. The sliding wedge breech slams shut. The sound of the lock closing rings out like a death sentence. "Ready," the loader exhales. He collapses heavily onto the floor, covering his head with bloodied hands. The countdown begins. 12 seconds. That is how long the enemy motorized infantry needs to cover the remaining 30 meters. It is enough time for them to toss heavy grenades into the open hatches. The commander looks at the lead group. Elite stormtroopers. An officer with a raised submachine gun. An APC supporting the line from behind. Perfect density. A perfect target for total annihilation. "Fire!" The gunner slams the firing lever. The steel firing pin strikes the primer. Inside the cramped iron box, kilograms of artillery powder detonate. A point-blank shot from a super-heavy howitzer has nothing to do with sound. It is a pure kinetic strike of colossal density. The space in front of the SPG's frontal armor instantly collapses. The barrel vomits a blinding pillar of red-hot flame 15 meters long. The gas pressure at the muzzle reaches critical levels. The 43-kilogram shell leaves the barrel at 600 meters per second. It slams into the lead enemy APC a fraction of a moment later. The physics of the large caliber work flawlessly. A monstrously powerful HE explosion tears through space. The steel hull of the German machine ceases to exist in any recognizable form. The multi-ton APC instantly evaporates. It turns into a cloud of white-hot shrapnel, liquid metal, and fire. The epicenter of the blast generates temperatures that melt steel. A shockwave of inhuman power strikes out in all directions. It crumples the advancing column like thin paper. The elite stormtrooper group is erased into dust in a single second. Living torches are hurled dozens of meters. Infantry within a 40-meter radius of the epicenter suffer fatal barotrauma. Internal organs rupture from the sudden pressure spike. The reflected shockwave slams into the Soviet machine's frontal armor with a wild roar. 43 tons of metal shudder. The SPG is thrown back half a meter. The broken track links bite into the ground with a crunch. The interior light fixtures tear away from the ceiling of the fighting compartment. Thick, acrid dust instantly fills the cramped casemate. The vision blocks shatter into fragments. Shards of thick glass lash the faces of the crew. The men lie on the iron floor. They are deafened and half suffocated. Their bodies instinctively curl up, waiting for the inevitable detonation of their own ammo racks. That second lasts an eternity. The detonation does not happen. The armor held against the return kinetic strike. The gun breech is smoking heavily. It emits the nauseating stench of burnt artillery powder. The lieutenant slowly lifts his heavy head. A thick, monotonous ringing fills his ears. His hearing is completely destroyed. He pulls himself up with difficulty on weakened arms. He presses himself to the open embrasure of the shattered observation device. There is no longer an enemy in front of the machine. There is nothing living in front of the machine. Only a massive, smoking black crater where the APC once stood. Mangled pieces of melting metal burn in the tall grass. The torn bodies of enemy soldiers are scattered across the ravaged slope of the hill. Thick pine trunks have been snapped like matchsticks by the blast wave. Total annihilation has occurred. In that very moment, the commander's consciousness forever alters its original structure. The school math teacher has finally vanished. The calculations are finished. The formulas are erased. All that remains is the icy recognition of fact. The mechanics of the ambush worked perfectly. The engineering task is complete. The breakthrough of the front has been prevented. The price of his own survival no longer matters. The lieutenant looks at the smoking battlefield with an absolutely hollow, scorched gaze. There is no regret in it. There is no triumph or joy of victory. Only the heavy, bitter taste of cordite grime on his parched lips. Only the absolute, cold understanding that he has just extinguished dozens of human lives with one short press of a steel lever. The iron ledger is closed. The deafening silence presses on his ruptured eardrums harder than the blast wave. The mechanisms, torn apart by the colossal recoil, leak thick hydraulic fluid. The massive 152mm gun barrel is jammed solid in the full recoil position. The hydraulic recoil buffers are completely destroyed. The metal of the recoil system has snapped along the thick, welded seams. Inside the cramped casemate, a thick fog of toxic propellant gases, atomized motor oil, and fine glass dust from the shattered vision blocks hangs in the air. The crew breathes heavily, lying on the floor littered with spent brass casings. The loader loses consciousness from traumatic shock. The shattered bones in his foot are rapidly swelling inside his blood-soaked boot. The gunner stares blankly at his mangled fingers. The skin has been stripped to the raw meat against the jammed hand wheel. The commander leans against the mangled breech. His face is covered in a thick crust of black soot and clotted blood. The battle is over. Outside, the steady drone of truck engines grows louder. These are not heavy German diesels. The sound is different.
The clang of the commander's hatch being opened lets in blinding daylight and a rush of fresh air. The oxygen cuts his scorched lungs like a razor. With immense effort, the lieutenant pulls himself up on weakened arms and looks out. 3 staff cars are rapidly approaching the position of the knocked-out SPG. Officers with clean shoulder boards step out of the vehicles. No mud, no cordite grime. Perfectly pressed uniforms. The creak of new leather Sam Browne belts. A counterintelligence major leads the way. His cold, piercing gaze instantly scans the mangled Soviet machine. He does not look at the burning German motorized column in the hollow. He looks only at the shattered track links and the torn-off gun shields. "Vehicle commander, on the ground." The major's voice sounds dry, like the click of a cocked hammer. The lieutenant jumps heavily from the hot armor. His legs buckle from monstrous physical exhaustion, but he maintains his balance. He struggles to snap to attention before the staff officer. The paper front opens its merciless fire. The action shifts into a stage of absolute psychological suppression. The blind, bureaucratic machine begins to methodically grind down the survivor. "Name, rank. Why was the vehicle not scuttled?" The major pulls a clean sheet of paper from his map case. A pen hovers over the document. Division Headquarters Order Number 48 mandated the immediate destruction of materiel and the crew's withdrawal to the rear. A captain from the staff standing nearby barks in an icy tone. "You violated a direct command order in a combat situation. The enemy was flanking an open position," the lieutenant rasps. The math teacher looks directly into the investigator's cold eyes. "The closing speed left the infantry no chance. The division would have been encircled in 40 minutes. You are not the Army Chief of Staff, Lieutenant, to be assessing the operational situation." The major makes a sharp notation in the report. "You are a gun commander. Your job is to follow orders. You abandoned your crew to certain death. You took it upon yourself to dispose of state property." The counterintelligence investigator takes a step forward. He runs a hand fastidiously over the armor shields of the breach, which were torn away by the sledgehammer. "Intentional damage to combat equipment. Destruction of safety mechanisms. Violation of the Manual of Guard and Garrison Service, Article 58. Intentional sabotage. This is a firing squad offense, Lieutenant. The tribunal will have the paperwork finalized in 15 minutes. The hero's life hangs by a thin thread. The collision of trench truth and blind rear echelon instruction reaches a critical point. The air hums with tension. This confrontation weighs on the psyche more heavily than the sight of an armor-piercing shell flying head-on. There, in the white-hot casemate, everything was decided by physics and the thickness of Krupp steel. Here, on the green grass, a life is crossed out by a single stroke of an ink pen. The counterintelligence major slowly unbuttons his holster. His fingers settle on the checkered grip of his service pistol. The threat of being shot in front of the formation for failure to follow orders becomes absolutely real. The military prosecutor's office is not interested in trench truth. The prosecutor is only interested in the report and the letter of the law. The lieutenant remains silent. He does not make excuses. He simply turns his head toward the hollow. Below, dozens of German armored vehicles are burning. Thick black smoke rises to the sky. The enemy's elite stormtrooper group has been torn to pieces by direct hits from HE frag shells. Hundreds of enemy corpses litter the earth, churned up by explosions. The breakthrough has been completely liquidated. The math teacher solved the unsolvable equation the only correct way. The staff prosecutor shifts his gaze to the destroyed column. Then he looks back at the mangled Soviet SPG. Cognitive dissonance breaks the bureaucratic logic. The system glitches.
To execute a commander who single-handedly destroyed the vanguard of an enemy motorized division would be to commit a political crime. The major slowly moves his hand away from his holster. He snaps his leather map case shut with a deafening click. "Crew to the hospital," the major barks, turning away from the lieutenant. "For insubordination, damage to entrusted property, and violation of direct radio protocols. A severe reprimand to be entered into the permanent record. For preventing a breakthrough of the front and the destruction of enemy armor, recommend the crew for state decorations." The officers turn in silence and head for their vehicles. The bureaucratic hell recedes, leaving behind a cold, clammy void. The lieutenant leans his back against the cooling armor of his battered machine. He slowly slides down the metal onto the scarred earth. Paradoxically, the headquarters' grim sentence is what keeps him alive. A medal for a bloody feat of arms and a reprimand for insubordination are filed away in the same folder. His psyche, which withstood point-blank combat, now develops a deep fracture under the pressure of the absurd rear echelon machine. The execution is stayed, but the war inside the man will now never end. The twisted metal on the nameless hill becomes an object of intense scrutiny. Engineers from the main artillery directorate arrive at the battlefield 2 days later. Specialists with stone-cold faces inspect the shredded tracks and the jammed gun mantlet of the heavy piece. They use tape measures to calculate the distances to the destroyed German armored personnel carriers. They record the impact angles. Calculations show that survival in such a situation is an absolute impossibility, according to all standard field manuals. The dry figures of the reports state the fact. Direct fire from a 152mm howitzer gun at a range of less than 100 meters obliterates any known armor. But this categorically contradicts the pre-war doctrine for self-propelled artillery. These heavy machines were designed exclusively for indirect fire from concealed positions. They were supposed to support the troop advance from a distance, staying well out of the enemy's line of sight. The truth of the trenches ruthlessly shatters staff theory. The insane initiative of a schoolhouse math teacher backed into a lethal corner proves its monstrous efficiency. The experience, paid for dearly with the crew's ruptured eardrums and shattered bones, is sent to Moscow via high-priority encrypted comms. The lumbering bureaucratic machine pulls a sharp U-turn. General Staff analysts transform an act of absolute soldierly desperation into a systemic, mass-produced weapon of breakthrough. Suicidal risk becomes the Red Army's new official offensive tactic. A large-scale modernization of heavy self-propelled gun employment begins. Machines on the assembly line receive new, improved telescopic sights for precision direct fire. The ballistic scales and fire control instruments are modified. Defense plant engineers urgently make hard corrections to the design of the recoil systems. They reinforce the hydraulic buffers. The mechanisms must withstand the colossal shock load of regular fire using concrete-piercing shells at point-blank range. Technical manuals are rewritten in the blood of surviving tankers. The 152mm caliber officially moves to the very edge of the war. The front's offensive gains unstoppable momentum. The steel steamroller grinds westward. Deeply echeloned German defensive lines rise in the path of the Soviet rifle divisions. The enemy digs in for dear life. The adversary pours thousands of tons of high-strength reinforced concrete into their firing points. Heavy machine gun pillboxes methodically mow down the advancing Soviet infantry by the battalion. Standard light field artillery is utterly powerless against 2-meter-thick monolithic walls. 76mm high-explosive shells leave nothing but shallow, dusty scratches on the German fortifications. A relentless conveyor belt of death begins for the attacking formations. The infantry is pinned down hard under a torrential rain of lead. Men press themselves into the mud, their chances of survival evaporating. At this critical moment, the new strike doctrine comes into play. Heavy self-propelled regiments move up to the zero line. 43 tons of Soviet steel crawl directly toward the embrasures, spewing machine gun fire. The crews no longer sit tight in the safety of the rear. They lead the first wave of the assault. Enemy anti-tank rounds strike sparks off the thick frontal armor of the SPGs. The driver's vision blocks are covered in the thick spiderweb of cracks from the continuous sleet of lead. But the heavy machines close the distance relentlessly. 800 meters, 500 meters, 300 meters, 100 meters. The firing line is reached. The massive gun barrels slowly depress. The optics crosshairs settle exactly on the narrow black slit of the death-spitting concrete pillbox. Inside the sweltering fighting compartment, a short, dry command rings out. The steel firing pin strikes the primer of the heavy brass casing. A concrete-piercing shell, weighing exactly 40 kilograms, screams from the muzzle with a deafening roar. The kinetic energy of this impact is beyond simple human comprehension. A chunk of high-strength hardened steel slams into the German reinforced concrete at 600 meters per second. A localized man-made earthquake occurs. The 2-meter reinforced concrete wall snaps like a fragile eggshell. The internal explosion crushes the thick rebar frame. The interior of the machine gun pillbox is instantly transformed into a horrific slurry of pulverized stone, mangled weapons, and shredded human remains. The impregnable firing point ceases to exist in a single second. The lethal machine gun fire is cut short forever. Dry operational reports from the front flow in a continuous stream. Batteries of modernized heavy SPGs methodically and cold-bloodedly crack open the enemy's defensive lines. They knock out the armored cupolas of fortified regions with direct shots. They crumble the thick brickwork of strongpoints into fine dust during fierce urban combat. The calculations of the unknown lieutenant mathematician work in practice 1,000 times over. The hard mathematics of total fortification destruction saves entire legions of Soviet infantrymen. Soldiers rise from the bloody mud and move through the breaches punched by the heavy caliber without critical losses. The dry mortality statistics of the rifle regiments during assaults plummet. Every direct fire shot is a life saved for the attacking infantry. It is time bought with blood. It is a breached defensive line. The weapon of vengeance quickly takes on a mass, systemic character. The SPG crews work to the point of total physical exhaustion. Loaders wear their palms down to raw meat, ramming heavy 80-pound shells into scorching breaches under a hurricane of fire. Drivers go blind from acrid powder gases and deaf from the continuous thunder of their own guns in the cramped compartments. But the conveyor of enemy fortification annihilation does not stop for a single minute. The iron mechanism is running at full power. An individual act of desperation beyond the limits of human endurance becomes the hard, inevitable standard of modern total war. May 1945. The capital of the defeated enemy lies in smoking ruins. Pulverized brick dust covers the tank-mangled cobblestones in a thick layer. The spring air is saturated with the acrid stench of soot, rotting flesh beneath the rubble, and spilled diesel fuel. Victory does not taste like joy. Victory tastes like lead, machine oil, and dry ash on cracked lips. The former SPG commander stands motionless on the shattered steps of the government quarter. His tunic has faded to a ghostly white. His left shoulder is unnaturally slumped after a severe wound. His eardrums are permanently ruined by the pressure spikes of point-blank, super-heavy fire. The world sounds muffled, as if through a thick layer of cotton wool. A colonel from front headquarters stands beside him. The officer hands the lieutenant a cardboard folder, an assignment to the Higher Artillery Academy. "You are a natural tactician," the staff officer says dryly. "Your ballistic calculations saved a division from being encircled. Frontline experience requires systematization. The academy is waiting. The army needs analysts like you." The lieutenant drops his heavy gaze to the colonel's polished boots. Then he looks at his own hands. Black weapon grease and powder soot are permanently etched into the deep pores of his skin. "My calculation destroyed hundreds of lives." The former commander's voice sounds raspy and monotonous. "I've burned through my limit of deaths in this war. I refuse. I'm going home, back to the blackboard." He turns and walks away. His career as a military strategist is over. The war is finished for him in the physical world, but it is only beginning its destructive work in his ravaged mind. September 1945. A quiet provincial town deep in the rear. A school classroom is submerged in a ringing silence. Outside the window, a cold rain drizzles monotonously. The sound beats methodically against the former lieutenant's frayed nerves. He stands at the chalkboard. In his right hand, he tightly grips a small piece of white school chalk. The weight of this piece is no more than 10 grams. Muscle memory rebels against this lightness. His hands instinctively seek the familiar weight of a 40-kilogram concrete-piercing shell. His scarred fingers remember the searing cold of the casing. The chalk suddenly snaps in half from an uncontrollable spasm in his hand. White powder spills onto the old wooden floor. The math teacher methodically writes a geometric formula on the board. Flight trajectory, barrel elevation angle, initial velocity of kinetic impact. To the students sitting at their desks, these are just abstract variables. To him, they are coordinates of a lethal strike seared into his brain. Pure mathematics is forever poisoned by blood. Every digit he writes smells distinctly of burnt cordite. Night brings an uncontrollable physiological hell. The darkness of the small room instantly shrinks to the claustrophobic dimensions of a sweltering steel SPG compartment. The air becomes unbearably thick and sticky with the phantom smell of cordite. The veteran bolts upright on his narrow iron bed. Cold, clammy sweat soaks his gray face. His chest heaves, gasping for oxygen. His damaged hearing catches the non-existent metallic clank of snapping tracks. In the perfect silence, he clearly hears the death rattles of German motorized infantry burning alive. He sees the flaming faces of the enemy a second before the point-blank shot. The backblast hits him in the chest again and again. Twisted metal tears with a horrific screech. He mechanically reaches his hands into the void, desperately trying to find a heavy steel crowbar to pry open the jammed gun mantlet. His fingers claw at the thin blanket. The past holds his psyche in a dead steel grip. Guilt for the people ground into bloody dust methodically gnaws a hole through his sanity. Physics class. Topic: kinetic energy and ballistics. 30 pairs of children's eyes stare at the faded ribbon bars on the teacher's worn jacket. To them, he is a living, infallible legend. One of the students shoots his hand up.
"Comrade teacher,"
The boy's voice rings with admiration.
tell us how you destroyed that column all by yourself. What is it like to perform a heroic deed? You weren't afraid of anything in that moment, were you?
Another piece of chalk snaps with a dry crunch in the veteran's hand. The teacher slowly turns to the class. His face turns into a grey, absolutely motionless mask. His eyes reflect only the dead void of a scorched battlefield. A heroic deed. The teacher's voice sounds unnaturally hollow. He leans hard with both hands on the edge of the desk. War is not a pretty movie. War is a heavy, filthy routine of killing other people. It's when you're locked tight in a steel box where the temperature exceeds 50 degrees, when you're breathing toxic gas, dust, and your own vomit. The class freezes. The excitement in the boy's eyes is replaced by genuine fear. But the veteran can no longer stop the flow. There is no fearlessness there, the former lieutenant rasps. Every word falls to the floor like a lead weight. There is only endless, animal terror and cold calculation. You think only about how to drive 40 kilograms of steel into someone else's armor faster than they drive their slug into you. I am not a hero. I simply calculated the correct angle of the gun. I mechanically pressed the steel trigger. And then I watched through a shattered sight as living people turned into nothing but charred chunks of torn meat, pressed into the road mud. The shock waves stripped the skin off them while they were still alive. I did that with my own 2 hands. The silence in the classroom becomes absolutely unbearable. They turn people into mincemeat there, he states in a dry tone, devoid of any emotion. War turns a man into a professional killer. That is its only law, and that law has no exceptions. The teacher turns his back to the class. His hands tremble betrayingly, revealing the extreme degree of his internal exhaustion. All romantic illusions are razed to the ground. Blind bravado is ground to dust. All that remains is the ugly truth that the surviving professional will carry on his shoulders until the end. Time does not heal a shattered psyche. Time simply lays down a thick layer of heavy, everyday dust over open, continuously bleeding wounds. 1982. An ordinary small apartment in a standard prefabricated block. An old man walks slowly down a narrow hallway. His left leg drags heavily across the worn linoleum. His joints are irreversibly destroyed by the monstrous recoil of the heavy gun. The pain in his bones works like a precision barometer, predicting every change in the weather. A cheap hearing aid emits a foul, high-pitched squeal. The device is unable to compensate for eardrums that were completely obliterated. The world remains a deaf, distorted echo. The veteran makes it a point not to go to holiday parades. His dress jacket is locked away in the furthest corner of an old, creaky wardrobe. The heavy government award is covered in a dull, dead patina. The medal for preventing a frontline breakthrough lies in the same box as a faded sheet containing a formal reprimand for damaging state property. 2 worn pieces of paper. 2 equal outcomes of a single, bloody slaughter. The pensioner sits heavily at the cramped kitchen table. He carefully lays out a stack of old student notebooks before him. The habit of checking calculations has remained in his motor skills forever. Scarred fingers with toughened skin methodically trace red ink corrections on the white paper. This is the only mathematics that no longer kills people. The neighbors on the landing see him as just a grumpy, withdrawn old man. They don't know about the 43 tons of mangled steel. They don't know about the point-blank shot with a concrete-piercing shell. The old man never talks about the war. Any conversation about the past triggers a hard spasm in lungs scorched by powder gases. His breath catches instantly. An orange pillar of searing fire from the muzzle flashes immediately before his eyes. He methodically erases these images from his mind, but they inevitably return every night. Sleep brings only cold sweat and the phantom smell of burnt cordite. Autumn, 1988. The hospital ward smells of bleach and cheap medicine. The smell is sharp and chemical. For the dying veteran, this nauseating scent instantly transforms into the acrid stench of burnt weapon grease and spilled diesel. The worn-out heart suffers an irreversible failure. The biological motor stops. The life support equipment emits a steady, monotonous hum. This sound breaks through the remnants of his destroyed hearing. It turns into the low-frequency rumble of an advancing German motorized column. The enemy is reaching the line again. The distance is closing fast. The old man's consciousness finally plunges into the sweltering darkness of the fighting compartment of a knocked-out Soviet SPG. The white walls of the ward shrink to the cramped dimensions of the steel casemate. The temperature rises rapidly, searing his skin. The air becomes thick and unbearably heavy. The veteran opens his bloodshot eyes. Instead of the white coat of the duty nurse, he clearly sees the filthy, blood and sweat-soaked tunic of his loader. The soldier's face is contorted in unbearable pain from shattered foot bones. He reaches his bloody hands toward the breach. The metal is white-hot again. A fragment of a German anti-tank shell has jammed the elevating mechanism tight again. Death, in a gray uniform, is standing 30 meters from the frontal armor once more.
"High explosive,"
the old man whispers with parched lips. His shaking fingers convulsively clutch the white hospital sheet as if it were the handle of a heavy steel crowbar. No one hears the order. His pulse drops critically. His heartbeats slow down. They sound like heavy, dull blows of a sledgehammer against the mangled gun mantlet. 1, 2.
3. The metal gives way. The barrel drops down with a deafening crash. The dead zone is eliminated. The massive maw of the gun looks directly into the faces of the attacking infantry. "Fire!" The last raspy exhale leaves his punctured lungs with a dry crunch. The veteran's body jerks convulsively, as if taking the monstrous recoil of the 152mm caliber. His eyes glaze over. His facial muscles freeze forever in a tense, brutal grimace. The heart monitor flatlines. The shot has been fired. The battle is finally over. The ghosts of July 44 take their commander into the eternal, impenetrable silence. The ward is plunged into absolute peace. No tears, no solemn speeches, only the cold confirmation of a worn-out biological mechanism stopping. The duty doctor indifferently records the time of death. The paper form is filled out in a dry, bureaucratic hand. The Central Archive of the Ministry of Defense. Podolsk. Endless rows of massive steel racks recede into the deep perspective of a dimly lit concrete corridor. There is no room for human emotion here. Only compressed, dead memory is stored here. The metal shelves sag under the colossal weight of hundreds of thousands of identical cardboard folders. Fine gray dust slowly settles on the spines of the archival files. The air is extremely dry and cold. Climate control maintains the ideal temperature for preserving brittle paper. An archive employee in gray cotton gloves pulls a thin cardboard folder from a top shelf. The cardboard has yellowed and become very brittle from the passage of ruthless time. On the cover, the rifle division number and the date are written in faded purple ink. July 1944. Inside lie several sheets of thick typewritten paper. The edges of the sheets are badly frayed. The text was typed on an old typewriter with a sticking letter.
The black carbon ribbon left dull, uneven imprints of the characters. The dry lines of the operational staff report state the naked facts. Coordinates of the height.
The number of the destroyed self-propelled gun, the amount of heavy ammunition expended. The horrific battle is described in 3 short, clipped paragraphs. No mention of the loader's torn-off fingernails. No words about ruptured eardrums and blood leaking from ears. No data on the monstrous kinetic pressure and the nauseating smell of burnt human flesh. Only the dry, ballistic arithmetic of war. Enemy armored vehicles destroyed, 14 units. Enemy personnel losses, up to a company of motorized infantry. The advance of the German column halted, the front held. The story of the incredible salvation of entire legions of Soviet soldiers is locked tight within these faded lines. Millions of lives, entire generations of people came into the world only because one math teacher disobeyed a direct order and rammed a 40-kilogram shell into the barrel of a wrecked armored machine. But the archival document knows absolutely nothing of the subjunctive mood. It does not evaluate the colossal moral choice. It simply records the expenditure of ammunition and the list of destroyed enemy equipment. The archivist turns the last page of the document. On the back, a tiny scrap of gray paper is carelessly pinned. It is a copy of a report from the Counterintelligence Department, a reprimand for the intentional damage of the elevating mechanism of a state-owned combat vehicle. The investigator's signature is illegible. The ink stamp is hopelessly smudged. The folder closes with a dull thud. The sound of cardboard hitting cardboard instantly dissolves into the dead silence of the vast vault. The hand in the gray glove indifferently returns the file to the steel shelf. The rack clanks. The row of documents closes tight, forever hiding the story of the heavy gun and its unknown commander. The storage system works flawlessly. The inventory number is entered into the catalog. Access closed. The iron ledger of the war has been converted into dry archival statistics and buried under a thick layer of bureaucratic dust.